Malachi chapter 2 is where we'll be this afternoon, and this will be our sixth sermon in Malachi as we're going through this series, The Refiner's Fire, and just looking at this book of judgment, but also this book of faithfulness that the Lord has to His people. And last week we came into chapter 2 and just opening up as the Lord tells the priests and the Levites to lay it to heart to give glory to His name. And we looked at those things, and I wanted to go here last week, but I didn't get the chance, so I'm just going to throw it out for free tonight. Acts chapter 12, verses 20 through 24. Write that down, and then also Acts 14, 8 through 16. And those are two comparisons that I want to look at last week when it came to glorifying God. Acts 12 is when King Herod speaks to the people of Tyre, and they say it's the voice of a god. And immediately he was consumed of worms and died, and it says because he gave not God the glory. And then Acts chapter 14, verses 8 through 16 is where Paul and Barnabas are in the city, and Paul heals a lame man. And the people begin to shout that the gods had come down to him, and they named them Jupiter and Mercurius, and they came out, they were going to start sacrificing to Paul and Barnabas. And Paul and Barnabas go running in, rend their clothes from off of them, and rebuke them for doing that and preach Christ to them. And just that comparison of the glory of God, and it might be something interesting you want to look at this week. Just we didn't have time last week, but it's a good comparison for us to look at just this heart of Herod didn't give God the glory when they said it's the voice of a God, and then Paul and Barnabas, just that heart for Jesus Christ and His glory, caused them to get to the point where they're running in, stopping them, and preaching Christ to them. So I would just encourage you to look at that and think about those things. And then verse 4 we looked at where he opened up, he says, "And ye shall know that I have sent this commandment unto you, that my covenant might be with Levi, saith the Lord of hosts." So he kind of introduces this covenant with Levi, and that's what we're going to be looking at this week, just the title, Levi and the Covenant. And we're going to be looking at that, verses 5 through 9, but kind of springboarding out of verse 4 because that's where this covenant might be with Levi comes up. And as we're looking at Malachi in the scope of the whole Bible and in the scope of the whole world, we see that Malachi is a book that God has pulled out a small nation, right? The nation of Israel, we saw that in chapter 1, and Malachi is written specifically to them. But within that, you've got much of Malachi written to the tribe of Levi. We see them addressed several times. And then within Levi, we see that much of it addressed to specifically the priests. And so, as we've covered in chapter 1, he talks about the priest that despises his name, and then chapter 2, he says, this commandment is for you. Much of what he's writing in Malachi, much of what Malachi is preaching is directed to the priests and the Levites. And this text we're looking at today, Malachi 2, 5 through 9, explains the importance of that, kind of in depth. And we probably know most of it, but it's just going to go into detail of why specifically Israel. We saw that in chapter 1, there's chosen people. He's going to magnify himself from their border, but why the priests, why the Levites, why so much on them? And this passage where we see about this covenant explains that. So I'm going to read verses 5 through 9. It says, "My covenant was with him of life and peace, and I gave them to him for the fear wherewith he feared me and was afraid before my name. The law of truth was in his mouth, and iniquity was not found in his lips. He walked with me in peace and equity, and did turn many away from iniquity. For the priest's lips should keep knowledge, and they should seek the law at his mouth. For he is the messenger of the Lord of hosts. But ye are departed out of the way, ye have caused many to stumble at the law, ye have corrupted the covenant of Levi, saith the Lord of hosts. Therefore have I also made you contemptible and base before all the people, according as ye have not kept my ways, but have been partial in my law." Lord, I thank you for this day, everything that you blessed us with. Thank you for this passage and for your word as a whole. Please open our eyes and help us to see the beauty of it and see the challenge that you would have for us and what you're speaking to your people about through this. Please help us to have wisdom in that. It's in Christ I pray. Amen. So as we go on to this covenant with Levi, let's just do a quick history of Levi as quick as we can. So Levi he's one of the sons of Jacob. He's the third son of Jacob, and his mother was Leah. And Levi, we see him born there in Genesis, I believe, 31. But then in chapter 34 is where Jacob's daughter Dinah goes out to see the daughters of the land. and she's violated, and then the men of Shechem make the covenant with the sons of Jacob, and the sons agree, yeah, he can Shechem can marry Dinah, but all the men had to be circumcised. And so the men agreed to do that, or they were forced to it by the king, one of the two. Anyway, it happened, and we read where Simeon and Levi, these two brothers went in. Of course, the agreement they made was deceitful, and Simeon and Levi go in, kill all the men of the city because they can't really fight back. And the rest of the brothers go in and plunder the city and spoil it. And so that's kind of our first big introduction to Levi, is what he did there. And of course, he was involved in the selling of Joseph into Egypt. But as we move on to Genesis 49, Jacob's about to pass off the scene, and he gives prophecies of all of his sons and all of their descendants. And he talks about Reuben, and then he moves on and he talks about how Simeon and Levi, they were instruments of cruelty. Their wrath was cruel, their anger was deceitful, how they went in and did what they did. And he prophesies of both of them that the Levites and the Simeonites would be scattered among their people, among the people of Israel. And so that's a burden. We could look at it as a burden that comes down on Levi and Simeon, is that their descendants would be scattered among their people. And when we come into Joshua and they come in and take the promised land, we see that fulfilled, both of them, because the Levites ended up being the priests, and we're going to look at how that came to be. God gave 48 cities to the tribe of Levi, but they were scattered throughout all the rest of the tribes. And I believe that would be 4 cities in each tribe. And they were cities of refuge, many of them. But the cities and the suburbs were given to the Levites, so you had the whole tribe of Levi scattered throughout all of Israel. And so we see Jacob's prophecy comes true, that they were scattered, but we're going to see the grace of God in that. For what purpose they were scattered, but also Simeon's land allotment. You can read this in Joshua 19, verses 1 through 9, is that Simeon's plot of land is actually inside of Judah's. And so Judah was a much larger tribe, and the land that Simeon got was actually inside of Judah's land and kind of encompassed by it. And so we see both of those prophecies come true. But you can read about the 48 cities of Levi in Numbers 35, verse 7, and then also Joshua 21, also Joshua 13, 14, and 33 just go into Israel's inheritance being broken up among the tribes, but that Levi, his inheritance, was the sacrifices of the Lord. So as we move on from there, kind of the next big thing with Levi is going to be Exodus 32. And we're going to turn there later, but that's the golden calf incident. So Moses is up on the mountain getting the commandments from God. The people come to Aaron and say, hey, we don't know about this Moses guy. Make us gods so that we can worship them. So he has them bring their gold and their earrings, their necklaces, all those things. And he makes this golden calf, puts it out. The people are worshiping. It says that they rose up and play, and they weren't playing games. But it was not a good place where they fell into that idolatry and the sin that they were in. And then we see where Moses comes down off the mountain. Him and Joshua are coming, and Joshua says, I hear a noise. It sounds like the noise of war. And he says, well, it doesn't sound like the cry of those who are winning or those who are losing. And they're coming down off the mountain. And 1 Corinthians is going to tell us, and also Exodus, Moses came down, and all the people were acting very immorally down there worshiping the golden calf. And so he confronts Aaron about it, and Aaron said, well, the people, they said, make us a god, and I just took their gold, I threw it in a fire, and out popped a calf. And so that's what it is. But Moses, he then goes out to the side of the camp, and he says, who is on the Lord's side? Let him come over unto me. And we'll look at it in a few more minutes. But the Bible says that all the sons of Levi went over to where Moses was at. And it was because of that God made this covenant with Levi. This is why Levi went from a nation that was angry and deceitful, and so they're scattered amongst their people in judgment. They were still scattered, but there's the grace of God in that. When they chose to stand for Him and say, we'll be on the Lord's side, feared His name, that He made this covenant with them of life and peace. As they that day strapped on their swords and killed 3,000 people, they were given life and peace in that, made the priests of God. But we see that fulfillment. They were scattered, but it was for a new responsibility, and that responsibility was that they would do the sacrifices, that they would guard the tabernacle, and that they would teach the people God's law. And so that's Levi, and that's where we're coming to with this covenant, is that they were essentially the tribe of Levi. They were the priests, the guards of the tabernacle, the ones who carried the tabernacle and all those things as they traveled. But they were also going about, and we see it several places in the Bible, they were the ones going around teaching God's law to the people. And so they had a very special responsibility, a very special covenant. The Bible says that the Lord and His sacrifices were their inheritance. That's what they received, and it was a blessing, what they had. But that's why when we come to Malachi, that's why there's so much of a focus on the priests and on the Levites, is because these were the guys who were doing the sacrifices, bringing these gifts to God, making an atonement for the sins of the people. These were the ones guarding the tabernacle. These were the ones who carried it and who serviced it. And then also these were the ones responsible to teach the rest of Israel God's law. And that's why God's bringing so much judgment upon them because of their sin, is because they had a very serious job and needed to take it seriously for what they did. So that's the importance of Levi, and that's kind of bringing us up to this covenant. God made a covenant with them, and we're going to see exactly why. But they were God's priests. And so He's bringing this judgment because they, as we read in verse 8, they were departed out of the way that they had used to walk in. So point number 1 is the contents of the covenant. The contents of the covenant, and just A and B is life and peace, and then they were God's messengers. We see that in verse 5. He says, "My covenant was with him of life and peace." Life and peace were two parts of this covenant that God had made with Levi. And it says in verse 5, "And I gave them to him for the fear wherewith he feared me and was afraid before my name." This was something that God gave to the tribe of Levi because of something that Levi had done. The tribe of Levi had a fear for God's name. They were afraid before His name. And because of that, God made a covenant with them of life and peace. There's so many places we could have gone, but I just went through Proverbs and just wrote down a couple things about peace and the fear of the Lord and life. And it was interesting, so many verses in Proverbs 22:4, it says, "By humility and fear of the Lord are riches and honor and life." By the fear of the Lord is life. Proverbs 10:27, "The fear of the Lord prolongeth days." Proverbs 14:27, "The fear of the Lord is a fountain of life." Proverbs 19:23, "The fear of the Lord tendeth to life, and he that hath it shall abide satisfied, he shall not be visited with evil." Proverbs 14:26, "And the fear of the Lord is strong confidence, and his children shall have a place of refuge." Over and over through Scripture, we're going to see those who feared God's name had peace, and it tended to life. And so, whether that was here in the fear of the Lord is strong confidence, and his children shall have a place of refuge, there's peace in that. There's peace that we can trust the Lord and come to Him. And then the fear of the Lord tendeth to life, he that hath it shall abide satisfied. All these things, and we can look at these things that happen in the fear of the Lord is strong confidence. The fear of the Lord tendeth to life, so those who fear God, it's going to tend toward life. But what we see in Malachi 2 verse 5 is that God is standing there giving this life. He's giving this peace to those who fear Him. And in this covenant that was made with Levi was specifically made with them because they feared His name and they were afraid before Him. But these life and peace we see coming out of that fear of God. And so when we think about Exodus 32, and again we'll turn there shortly, when Moses said, "Who's on the Lord's side?" all the sons of Levi come over. He says, "Gird on every man his sword and go in and out and kill your brothers, kill your kinsmen." He said, don't even pay attention to who it is. But if they're in idolatry, kill them. And they killed 3,000 people that day. Guess who lived? The Levites. The one who feared God. They were given life. The ones who did not fear God were given death, but also the peace. All the sons of Levi came over to the Lord's side. All the other tribes dealt with funerals. All the other tribes dealt with families losing loved ones. But it was Levi that had the peace. It was Levi that had the life, and God had given that to them. And then also in verse 7, also part of the content of this covenant is the fact that they were God's messenger. For He is the messenger of the Lord of hosts. This is part of that content. And this messenger, this giving out the message of God, came in the sacrifices. It came in what they performed, what they pictured, what they did for the people. It came in the fact that they taught the people God's law. It came in the fact that they were there opening up the law to the people, reading it, speaking about it to them, and guarding the temple, guarding the sanctity of it, the safety of it, and they were God's messengers. So those were, and there's other things, but just sticking in Malachi here, verses 5 through 9, those are some of the contents of this covenant that God made. Life and peace were given to them because they feared. The covenant was made with them as a whole because they feared God's name. When Moses said, "Who is on the Lord's side?" they said, "Oh, that's us." And they went over, and it didn't matter what family they had to kill. It didn't matter what person they knew that was in the idolatry. They had more of a fear of God's name and of who God was to do what He said rather than to have any pity on those who went against Him. And so God has those things structured, and He gave them to them of life and peace. The second thing is the character of Levi. The character of Levi, letter A under that, we saw in verse 5 that they feared him. It says that the fear wherewith they feared me and was afraid before my name. This is part of the character of Levi in the past. This is in this passage, God's looking back at who Levi was, at what Levi used to be, and then He's contrasting that with who they were now, what they were now. And part of what they had been when this covenant was made is that they had a fear of God. They had a respect and a reverential awe and a fear of God. And it went beyond just respect. It got to the point where they actually feared God because to go against God meant death. And when we're driving down the road, driving down the highway, going a few miles over the speed limit, and we see a state trooper sitting in the middle of the highway, I don't tap my brakes because I respect him. I don't tap my brakes because I think, wow, he's really respectable. I tap my brakes because I don't want a ticket. I tap my brakes because I don't want the judgment, right? And that's really where a lot of fear of God comes in. And it is respect for Him. It is awe for Him. But there is that fear that Jesus spoke about. Don't fear him that can destroy the body, but fear Him that can destroy both the body and the soul in hell. And there ought to be that fear, and Levi had that. What we see, though, in chapter 1 is that current Levi didn't have a fear. They despised his name. They didn't fear his name. So now let's go back to Exodus 32 and just look at this passage of Exodus 32. Exodus 32, verses 21 through 29. I'll go ahead and just start reading. And Moses said unto Aaron, What did the people unto thee that thou hast brought this great sin upon them? And Aaron said, Let not the anger of the Lord wax hot. Thou knowest the people that they are set on mischief. For they said unto me, Make us gods, which shall go before us. For as for this Moses, the man that brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we wot not what is become of him. And I said unto them, Whosoever hath any gold, let him break it off. So they gave it me, then I cast it into the fire, and there came out this calf. Because that's how it works. And when Moses saw that the people were naked, for Aaron had made them naked unto their shame among their enemies, then Moses stood in the gate of the camp and said, Who is on the Lord's side? Let him come unto me. And all the sons of Levi gathered themselves together unto him. And he said unto them, Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, Put every man his sword by his side, and go in and out from the gate to gate, throughout the camp, and slay every man his brother, and every man his companion, and every man his neighbor. And the children of Levi did according to the word of Moses, and there fell of the people that day about 3,000 men. For Moses had said, Consecrate yourselves today to the Lord, even every man upon his son and upon his brother, that he may bestow upon you a blessing this day. And it came down to a choice. We either pay attention to our neighbor, we either look at our companion and disobey God, or we consecrate ourselves to God upon that person and say, This is the testimony of my fear for you, Lord, and my consecration to you is that I'm not going to pay attention that this is my companion or my neighbor, but my eyes are going to be on you. I'm going to fear your name. I'm on your side, not anybody else's side. And that obedience came out of that. And they feared him so much. They had that awe for him and that fear that it didn't come between them and their companions, but rather the fear of God in their life came between them and companions. That's really where we need to be, is not that I would back away from my fear of God to please companions, but that companions would back away from me, or companions would have to be pushed away from me, because nothing is going to come in between me and the fear of God. Because He's the one to fear. He's the one I'm going to stand before, not anybody else. Not any boss or friend or relative. On Judgment Day am I going to stand before. I'm going to stand before God and give account for my actions based on His thoughts and His law, not based on mine or anybody else's. But this fear of God that they had. But also, letter B, it says the law of truth was in his mouth, and that's verse number 6. And it says just that, the law of truth was in his mouth, and iniquity was not found in his lips. Levi was at a point where they were speaking truth. The law of truth was in their mouth. Iniquity was not found in his lips. This was part of the character of Levi. This is part of who Levi was as a people group, that God said, you fear me, I'm going to make this covenant with you, and the law of truth was in their mouth. Jeremiah says that he that hath my word, let him speak my word faithfully. And all of us could take a good lesson from that. We spend so much time speaking on so many things, speaking on what everybody has to say. But we've got the Word of God, and most of us probably have more than one copy of it. And he says, he that hath my word, let him speak my word faithfully. Faithfully with the amount of time we give it, faithfully to context and the teaching, all those things. But the law of truth was in Levi's mouth. Letter C, they walked with God in peace and equity. There was a peace. There was not a rebellion against God. There wasn't a turning from it. It was just peace, but also that equity, that justice, that fairness, that rightness before the Lord that he saw and he looked upon. And then D is that they turned many from iniquity. And that's again at the end of verse number 6, and did turn many away from iniquity. This is the character that Levi had. This was the Levi that God looked back upon and said, that's who I made my covenant with. That's who I said, you guys are going to be my priests, because they feared him. They spoke the truth. Iniquity wasn't anywhere in their lips. They walked with him in peace and justice, in righteousness, and they did turn many away from iniquity. And you could imagine for a short time, at least hopefully, after that incident in Exodus 32, each time somebody thought about going away from God, there was probably just that thought in their mind of, hey, you know what happened last time wasn't good, and so we're not going to do that. Numbers 25, if you want to turn there, this is, it was brought up this morning, and it is absolutely one of my favorite stories in the Bible. And Lee and I were actually talking about kid names the other day, and I said Phineas. For that very reason, because I love Phineas in Numbers 25, and just what he did. And I think we could use, I don't know, is plural of Phineas, Phinei? I don't know, it might be Phineases, I don't know. But we could use a lot of them. We could use a lot of guys who are going to stand up and take action. Not just have zeal, because we're going to see he had zeal. We're going to see he had tears, but there were a lot of men sitting around weeping. But he was the one who stood up. He said, you know what, we're done with this. This is over. And goes and does this work, and I love him for that. But in verse number 1 of chapter 25, and Pastor went over it, but Balaam had taught the people to commit fornication with the Midianites, or the Moabites. And they started doing that, and a plague was brought upon the people. And so picking up and there's this plague coming on. But in verse 6 it says, and behold, one of the children of Israel came and brought unto his brethren a Midianitish woman in the sight of Moses, and in the sight of all the congregation of the children of Israel, who were weeping before the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. So here's this guy. Much of Israel is gathered around weeping over this plague, weeping over the sin and the death that's coming, and the death that has come. And while they're doing this, there's someone with enough hatred for God, with enough despite for God's people, that he comes in and he brings this woman right in the presence, right past him, just walks past right into the tent. And verse 7, and when Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, the priest, saw it, he rose up from among the congregation and took a javelin in his hand. And he went after the man of Israel into the tent, and thrust both of them through, the man of Israel and the woman through her belly. So the plague was stayed from the children of Israel. And those that died in the plague were 24,000. And so we see here The people gathered together weeping, and my question, as I read this, I thought about the fact, I wonder how long they had been weeping. How long had it been that no one was taking any action? It was a simple action. He rose up, thrust them through with a javelin. But how long were they weeping? How long were they in this place of, we know this is bad, we know this is wrong, but no one's wanting to take any action? But Phinehas rises up, he goes in, takes the javelin, thrusts them through, and Phinehas, he was a Levite. He was the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron. And if I had to guess, if I was there, I would say that if I had some of the same ideas as that Israelite man, I probably would get rid of those ideas rather quickly after I saw what he had done. But we see several cases like this. They turned many away from iniquity. And there's so many more places, I'm sure several things that aren't recorded, but those are two that I see where Levi stepped up to the task, men of Levi, and turned many people away from iniquity. And part of this is also that the law of truth was in his mouth, that he was walking with the Lord in equity, and these things were coming out and turning away in conversation with people heading toward wickedness. They say, well, the law of truth says this, God's law says this, and turning those people away. But even in their actions, I'm sure there would have been some people who thought twice. You know, like a little child who touches a hot stove and gets burned. That next time they reach for it, there's that thought that says, you know what, I probably shouldn't do that. And God blessed Levi because of that, because of what they had. And we even see a covenant that the Lord makes with Phinehas, and we'll read it quickly. He says, And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, hath turned my wrath away from the children of Israel, while he was zealous for my sake among them, that I consume not the children of Israel in my jealousy. Wherefore say, Behold, I give unto him my covenant of peace, and he shall have it, and his seed after him, even the covenant of an everlasting priesthood, because he was zealous for his God, and made an atonement for the children of Israel. And we can't help but see that this javelin thrust through. It made a sort of an atonement for the people, and this plague was stayed. And God makes this covenant to Phinehas and to his seed forever of peace. And he says, because he was zealous for my sake. And so as we look here at Malachi, and God describes who Levi used to be, and we look at these passages where he says, who is on the Lord's side? And the tribe of Levi says, well, it might be my family, it might be my companions, it might be my neighbor, but it's the Lord. And they go over, and then Phinehas, they're sitting there. He says, you know what, we're done with this. Gets up, takes care of it, man of action, gets done what needs to be done, and is zealous for the Lord. And God makes a good promise to him of a covenant, of an everlasting priesthood and peace because of that zealousness. But this character of Levi, this was an impressive group of people. This was a people that we will look to and say, we wish we had some more of those types of people. We wish we had more people who the law of truth was in their mouth, who iniquity wasn't found in their lips. Guys that we could look at and say, they turn many people away from iniquity, whether that's by action or just teaching or prayer, whatever it is. But walking before God in peace and equity, loving justice. It's interesting in Deuteronomy 33, Moses gives a prophecy of Levi. And he talks about there, it's about 3 or 4 verses of prophecy about Levi. And in the first one, or the second verse, he talks about how his Urim and his Thummim should be with his Holy One. And with the one who was tried at Meribah and Massa. And those are the 2 places where the water coming out of the rock and the people chode with God. But in that, as you look through it, and he's telling Levi, let your Urim and your Thummim be with your Holy One. And Holy One's not capitalized there. It's not talking about God. But the Urim and the Thummim, there's a lot to that, and it was kind of fun to study it. But basically, what I came to understand, which could be flawed and you might know more, is that Urim is a word that means light and revelation, and that Thummim is one that means perfection and truth. And so the Urim and the Thummim that the priests had on their ephod is what they would use, and we see a couple places where they used them to get that light of perfection, that doctrine of truth, that revelation from God on what needed to be done. And we see several places, I didn't jot them down, but in Numbers where the priest, there were certain things where he had to use the Urim and the Thummim to get this revelation of light, of the truth from God. And he says there, Moses speaking to Levi, he says, let your Urim and your Thummim be with your Holy One. Let it be with the one who's godly. Because when we look at a people who needs revelation from God, who needs truth from God, we want it to be with godly people. We want it to be the godly one that has the responsibility of sharing this truth. And that's just an interesting passage But we see a very godly tribe in Levi. We see people who reflected God's nature. We see people who loved truth, who loved peace, who loved equity, and turning people from iniquity. God's in the business of doing all those things. And so this, the character of Levi there, who they were, what they had been. But the next we see is the corruption of the covenant. And there's a few things here. In verse 8 he says, "But ye are departed out of the way. Ye have caused many to stumble at the law. Ye have corrupted the covenant of Levi, saith the Lord." So there was a way that they had been in. There was a way that Levi had been walking in. But instead they went out of that way and corrupted this covenant of life and peace. This covenant that God had made with them, they corrupted it. And they had gone out of that way. And it says that they had caused many to stumble at the law. And just this morning we saw how the people in 1 Samuel, they hated and they abhorred the sacrifice of God. It was a stumbling block before them. And there's many things we could say about that. But in Malachi, as we see here, they used to be a people who loved the law of truth. It was in their lips. Iniquity wasn't found in their lips. And they loved this law. But instead, we see that now, instead of turning many people away from iniquity by the things that they spoke, we see that people are stumbling because of their actions. And so we see them being a stumbling block instead of a set of stairs, for lack of better words there. And then he says in verse 9, "Therefore have I made you contemptible and base before all the people, according as ye have not kept my ways, but have been partial in my law." So they hadn't kept God's ways. He had shown them his ways, and that was the law. The law that he had given them of how they were supposed to handle things, that was his ways. That was the ways that he had given them. They hadn't kept them, but they had turned from them. And it says that they had been partial in his law. Part of this corruption of the covenant is that they went from a people who the law of truth was in their mouth. They were turning many people away from iniquity to the point where they're being partial in God's law. And we see this all the way up to the Pharisees. In the things that they do, we see such a partialness. We see a hypocrisy amongst them. And what God shows is that they weren't supposed to be partial. They were supposed to teach everything. So all those chapters and chapters and chapters about what their clothes were supposed to look like, they were supposed to teach it faithfully. Right. All the things about the mold and the leprosy, all those things that they knew, that's what they were supposed to be teaching people. But instead they became partial in the law. Partial in the law also in the sense of they had gotten to the point where they would read and they say, a male lamb perfect without blemish. And they would just say, well, we're supposed to make a sacrifice. It doesn't matter what exactly it was. And this partialness where they stooped down and they left God's way. He said a spotless male without blemish. And they left God's way and were partial in that law and went to that instead. In Timothy, 1 Timothy, Paul is writing to him and he writes everything about how we ought to behave in the house of God, how to handle widows, how to handle entreating everybody. He goes down through a bunch of things and he says, don't prefer one of these over another. He tells Timothy to be a good minister, you have to instruct the people in all these things. But also in the corruption, notice in verse 7 he says, "For the priest's lips should keep knowledge." This is also part of that covenant, but I saved it for here because we see a corruption in the priests in what they said. And it's interesting that their lips should have kept knowledge. But what we see instead is that through Malachi, we're going to see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. If I count it correctly, we're going to see 10 times where the priests open their mouth and say something. And none of it has any sort of knowledge in it at all. All of it is just full of ignorance, full of, pardon my word, but stupidity, and no knowledge whatsoever. But God says their lips were to keep knowledge. But instead in chapter 1, he says, "I have loved you." And in verse 2, they say, "Wherein hast thou loved us?" This is what they were speaking to him. This is what they said back to the God who chose them, to the God who fought for them, to the God who had made all these promises, had never let them down. And these priests look and they say, "Wherein hast thou loved us?" There wasn't knowledge in their lips in that. Farther down in chapter 1 where they offer the corrupt sacrifices, they say, "Wherein have we polluted thee?" Did they not have the discernment to see that their sacrifices were a blight to God? They were pulling him down from his holiness and who he was, how they should have been revealing him to the people. But instead they just look and they say, wherein have we polluted thee? Sure, I'm offering a lame animal, I'm offering one that's diseased, I'm offering one that nobody wants, but how are we polluting thee? Then they go on to say how the table of the Lord is contemptible, how it's a weariness. All through the book, and we'll look at each one. But Levi and the priest, they are continually just speaking with no knowledge. And this corruption came at a point because they had gone out of God's way, because they had left that, because they were being partial in the law. They were causing many people to stumble at the law, and part of that was they had given up knowledge. They had given up knowing God. They had given up knowing the law because they had the law. It was given to them. They should have known it. They could have known it. But instead, they turned from it. They left it. They walked away to their own thoughts, to their own desires, and what they wanted to know and hear. And then also it says, and they should seek the law at his mouth. Part of this was the priest. They were supposed to seek the law at his mouth, and that's because, for he is the messenger of the Lord of hosts. Because he's the messenger of the Lord of hosts, his lips should keep knowledge, because that's the message God is giving. God's given the message of in Daniel where it says the people that know their God will do exploits. He's given a knowledge that says, then shall we know if we follow on to know the Lord. He's given this knowledge and this way to know him. And the lips of the priest should have kept that knowledge to know the Lord. And they should have been seeking the law at his mouth. Okay? Because whose message were they giving? They were giving God's message. And so where should they have been seeking? They should have been seeking God's mouth. They should have been seeking what God had said to give to the people. But instead we look, what message are they giving? What message were they giving out? They're God's messengers, supposed to be seeking the law at his mouth. So going to God, getting the message, taking that message to the people. But instead, what message are they sending? We saw it in 1 Samuel even today. They're sending a message to where the people, instead of loving the sacrifice, instead of loving the worship, they hated it. With what they were doing with the women on the priest steps and the abuse and things like that with taking the offering by force. What does that portray about God? What does that show about him? What message are they giving? And it's because they had quit seeking the law at his mouth. And they were seeking the law at what they wanted. They were seeking the law of their heart. And their heart was set on iniquity. And they had turned from that. And so they corrupted this covenant. Instead of it being one of life and peace and being God's messenger, instead they're given a false message about God. They're given a message of hatred for God and a message of rebellion. And instead of life and peace, God says, we saw it last week, he said, I'm going to curse your blessings. I'm going to spread dung upon your faces. You'll be taken away with it. And he says that he had made them contemptible and base before all the people, according as ye have not kept my ways, but have been partial in my law. According to what they had done, because of what they had done, he had made them base and contemptible before the people. And we can't help but see that word contemptible back in chapter 1, where they say the table of the Lord is contemptible. The offering, his meat, it's contemptible. And God says, well, if you're making me contemptible before the people, which is what they were doing, because the people were abhorring the sacrifice and not desiring it, not fearing God. God says, I can play that game too. And I'll make you base and contemptible before the people in what they had done. But this covenant of Levi, and this is why Levi is so important. This is why we look to Malachi and says, well, he takes the whole world and he zeroes in on one people. And then there he zeroes in on the Levites. And then within the Levites, he zeroes in on the line of Aaron, which were the priests. And he does that because they're his messenger. They are the ones that are taking God's message to the people. And then from their border, he's going to be magnified to the Gentiles, to the heathen, to the rest of the world. And they had corrupted that covenant. They had turned away from their job, their responsibility, their privilege of speaking the message of God. And instead, they're given a message of that God is not pure, that God is not perfect, that God is not righteous, that God doesn't care about how we worship or what we give to him. They're given a false message about God, and because of that, God is going to defend his holiness. God's going to defend his righteousness, and he's going to show who he is when he comes down and begins to judge these people. Real quickly, and we'll finish up, turn to Jeremiah chapter 6. Jeremiah chapter 6, there's much in here, but we'll just kind of highlight a few things. Beginning in verse 10, he says, to whom shall I speak and give warning, that they may hear? Behold, their ear is uncircumcised, and they cannot hearken. Behold, the word of the Lord is unto them a reproach. They have no delight in it. We see that in the priests in Malachi. No delight in the law of God. They should have been seeking the law at his mouth. The law of truth used to be in their mouth, but instead they've got no delight in it. In fact, what God had said to do, all the law that he had given them of the sacrifices, they says it's contemptible, it's a weariness, it's not something that they took delight in. But the word of the Lord was unto them a reproach, and they had no delight in it. You know, a lot of Christians are at that spot today where the word of the Lord is a reproach to us. Because like Hebrews 4:12 says, it comes in, it discerns between the thoughts and intents of our heart. It divides asunder soul and spirit. It says things we don't like. It reveals things to us that we don't want to be revealed to us. And it's more of a reproach than a blessing to us. But then he talks about how he's full of fury and he's going to speak and he's going to preach. And then God's going to bring judgment. Their houses and their fields and their wives are going to be given to another person. For I will stretch out my hand upon the inhabitants of the land, saith the Lord. Then in verse 13, he says, for from the least of them, even unto the greatest of them, every one is given to covetousness. We saw that in chapter 1, when the priest wouldn't shut the doors or kindle the fire for naught. It was just all greediness. And he says, and from the prophet, even unto the priest, every one dealeth falsely. And we're looking at Jeremiah here, man, who's preaching the true message. But all through Jeremiah, you're seeing false prophets rise up. You're seeing false prophets come up with a false message of peace, and that's what he says in verse 14. They have healed also the hurt of the daughter of my people slightly, saying peace, peace, when there is no peace. There's a lot of churches today that are healing the hurt slightly. They're saying peace, peace, when there is no peace. They're pointing them to the things that they can do to have peace with God. They're pointing them to, I was reading something just the other night, 5 steps to killing the pride in your life. Number 3 was you need God's help. But even in that, Galatians says, they that are in Christ have crucified the flesh with the affections and lust thereof. I don't need 5 steps to kill pride. Pride was killed on the cross when I was placed in Christ. But this is the message we're giving people. We're giving this message, 10 steps to a better you. We're giving these medications to help me when I'm feeling depressed, when I'm feeling anxious. When he says, don't be careful, but come in prayer. When he's saying the joy of the Lord is your strength, and in faith we rise up above our circumstances. We're looking at verses in 1 John that say, faith is the victory that overcomes the world. And we say, well, by faith I got to do these 5 things so I can be an overcomer. When the next verse he says, he that overcometh is one that believes that Jesus is the Son of God. We're looking at Romans 8 where it says we are more than conquerors. And we close our Bible and say, well, I got to try to be more than a conqueror today. We miss that word are. We are more than conquerors. In Colossians 2, he says, ye are complete in him. And we shout it and say, man, I got to try to be complete in him today. He says, ye are complete. But what we do when we do that, when we open up these passages and see when God says definite things, this happened on the cross, you're free from sin. He says in Romans 6, sin shall not have dominion over you, for you are not under the law, but under grace. In Colossians 2, it says that the law was against us, it was contrary to us. Jesus Christ took it out of the way, nailed it to his cross. 1 Corinthians 15 says that the strength of sin is the law. When Jesus Christ died on that cross, not only did he forgive all our trespasses, past, present, future, forgiven in the blood of Christ, cleansed from all unrighteousness when we get saved, but it's in the fact that he says he took that law and he took it out of the way. The law is the strength of sin. He took the strength of sin out of the way, and that's why he says in Romans 6, sin shall not have dominion over you because we're not under the law but under grace. If we were under the law, if we were under the strength of sin, sin would have dominion over us. But Christ, he forgave our sins with his blood, and he took the law out of the way, the strength of sin, nailed it to his cross. And that's why sin doesn't have dominion over us as believers. That's why we're not brought into captivity to sin. That's why sin doesn't have dominion over us, because the strength of sin is gone. And so we look and say the strength of sin was taken out of the way on the cross, 1 Corinthians 15, and that cross makes us more than a conqueror. But what we do so many times is like these priests and these false prophets. When the message of God is one thing, they're coming up and saying, well, no, it's this. And they're healing, they're saying peace, peace, and there is no peace. What we're doing a lot of times is giving people a message of hope, hope, when there is no hope in that. When we're giving them meds, when we're giving them steps, when we're giving them all these things, what we need to give them is Christ. Amen. What we need to give them the true answer. Amen. And say it's not what you do, but it's just faith. It's not what you do, but it's what he did on the cross. Amen. You don't have to wake up every morning and die to sin daily. How do you do that? Jesus says he died unto sin once, and we're placed into that death. But what we do when we come up with these works and these patterns and these systems is we walk away from faith. We walk away from the true hope. We walk away from the true healing to that hurt, which is the blood of Christ. And we say, peace, peace, and there is no peace. And then it says in verse 15, were they ashamed when they had committed abomination? Nay, they were not at all ashamed, neither could they blush. Therefore they shall fall among them that fall. At the time that I visit them, they shall be cast down, saith the Lord. They could not blush at their abomination. When we come to Malachi and these priests offering these abominations, offering these evil things, the blush had gone away. That shamefacedness had left, and they were at the point to where they could no longer be embarrassed about their sin. This wickedness, even just read, not getting too deep into it, but even in Exodus, he says, Moses came down, all the people were naked. Where was the shame? Where was the blushing? It was gone. They had got to the point so carried away that it was gone. But in verse 16, this is kind of where we're getting. He says, thus saith the Lord, stand ye in the ways, and see, and ask for the old paths, where is the good way, and walk therein, and ye shall find rest for your souls. But they said, we will not walk therein. As we think about this fact that Levi went out of the way, they quit keeping God's way. And then we come to Jeremiah 16, as he's dealing with the same things in verses 19 and 20. He's dealing with their sacrifices. He says they're not acceptable. Many of the same things we see in Malachi. And he says, stand in the way and seek the old paths. Look for that good way. Look for that way, Levi, where you used to walk. Look for that way when you kept my way, when you loved my law, when you turned many people away from iniquity, when you walked with me in peace and justice and equity, when you feared my name. But they said, we will not walk therein. They made this choice. He says in the next verse that he gave them a watchman who blew a trumpet. And they said, we won't hearken. And so many people in that place, and these priests and Levites in Malachi had gotten to the place where God's given them this message, where Jeremiah gave them this message of turning back to God, walking in the way of the Lord, following Him. The way of the Lord is strength to the upright, but there's a way that seems right to a man. The end thereof are the ways of death. And we see these things in Proverbs. We see all through the Bible. But Malachi said, no, we're not going to walk. Or Malachi preached his message. The priests, the Levites that we see, they said, no, we're not going to walk in that way. We're not going to walk in the good way. We're not going to keep the ways of God. We're going to be partial in His law. We're going to despise His sacrifices. We're going to give a bad message to the people. And it brought the nation down. It brought so much sin amongst the people because the messengers of God, the ones who knew the hope, the ones who knew where the real peace was at, sacrificed that and offered a light help. They offered it slightly. Peace, peace when there is no peace. Yes, bring the sacrifice, God will accept it. God said, I'm not going to accept it. But they turned from the law of truth. They turned from that fear of God and offered these things. And many times we find ourselves in that same place. And so when we think about this covenant of Levi, the contents of it of life and peace, what a blessing that was to them. But it came out of that fear of God, that fear that tends to life, that fear that helps us abide satisfied. But most of all tonight, that corruption of the covenant versus that character of Levi. What Levi had been, fearing God, walking before Him in truth and equity, in righteousness, to where they had gotten to the point where they're hating God's name. It says they departed out of the way. God says in verses 4, He says all that judgment from verses 1 through 4 that He's going to bring. He says in verse 4 of chapter 2, I'm going to do this that my covenant might be with Levi. God's desire was this continual covenant. We see that in chapter 3 as well. He says, I'm going to come like a refiner's fire. Then ye shall offer a pure offering, a peaceable offering, an offering that He would delight in. But Levi, they had gone out of the way. Levi had corrupted the covenant. Levi had made the choices to go away from God, walk in their sin. But God is still there offering refining. God's still there offering grace. God's still there offering the true peace that comes when they fear Him. The true peace that comes when they turn back to Him and keep His ways. That true peace that comes when they love Him rather than hate Him and walk in obedience before Him. And that covenant and this character, may we pray for people. May we pray to be people who have that character that Levi used to have. And not be people who walk away from it, not be people who we could look back and we say, well, 15 years ago they feared God, but now look where they're at. 15 years ago they turned many people away from iniquity, but now they're causing people to stumble at God's law because they've forsaken God. May we be faithful. May we be walking with God as He's faithful with us, as He's the one who supplies us with the ability to do that faithfulness. May we make the choice. May we, like these priests, lay it to heart to give glory to His name, to walk before Him in peace and equity, and not turn away from that. Not this downhill progression, but each and every day just getting to know God better, fearing God more, walking with Him in that peace and that equity. And a great blessing came upon Levi because of that.